name is Devin Yu. I'm a full-time lecturer at CTCA, Chinese Theological College, Australia. We are based in Burwood, New South Wales. I mainly teach church history, systematics, philosophy. When the conference organizer asked me to do a presentation with Herbert, I'm very excited because this is something that has been not bothering, but it has been puzzling me for a long time. If you ask me whether I'm a first generation church leaders or second generation, it's hard to say, maybe 1.5, because if you define first generation as those who are from, for example, a home country, having moved to Australia, so they were raised in their home country, they are more adhere to their home country leadership style. If you call that first generation, then of course second generation will be those leaders who are raised here. Maybe they came here with their parents when they were young. But then for me, I came here when I was 16, so I was pretty young, but not that young. Usually if you came before maybe 10, then you'll be classified as first generation. But then for me, I came with my parents, so I'm more second generation. But having said that, I went to high school here, I went to uni here, and I became Christian when I was 16 or 18. And then I did all my tertiary education here in English, and I did my theological education here in English as well. So I can say I sort of like, I'm in between, so 1.5 is the correct description. And when I think, oh, this is a really good topic, why don't they listen to me? I think it applies to me as well, because as I said, I'm 1.5. So I have children. You'll be listening to one of my two children. Jackie is my daughter. So she may ask me, or she may say to me, why don't you listen to me? Or I may say to my parents, why don't you listen to me? Or I may say to my senior pastor or my principal, why don't you listen to me? So, as I said, 1.5. But then, usually you may expect, as a full-time lecturer, you may expect me to come up on stage and just give a speech or presentation, so on and so forth. But that is the traditional way of doing things. That's a modern way of doing things. But we are no longer in the modern period. We are in postmodern period. What does that mean? It means that we read the same Bible, but we read it with a different cultural lens. We have different linguistic expression because we have different background. And it is very important for us to realize first generation have a totally different upbringing, language, culture, leadership style than second generation. So what's the best way of illustrating this? I suppose the best way is not by us telling them what to do. Instead, asking them to come up and share their own experience so that we can also learn from them. We can also listen to them. I think this is the best way to model, because this is what Christ did. He came, he incarnated to a foreign place to become us, to become human. I think we always talk about we should be a missionary, we go outside to far country. Sometimes it's easier that way than to be a local missionary in your own home, in your own culture, or even in your parents' culture. To be a local missionary is a lot difficult, a lot more hard to do. So I say the best way to do it is to gather them along. This is actually Herbert's idea, but I think it's a wonderful idea. So get two representatives from the second generations and ask them questions. I think you'll hear later on that they have shared very frankly, and to my surprise and beyond my expectations, I've learned a lot. I think I will be a wiser father and also a wiser pastor, and there are a lot I can teach to my future second generation and first generation pastors to have really listening ears, to be an active listener. So I enjoy the interviews. I hope you do as well. So now we have Herbert joining us, and also Eric Poon, and also Jackie Yu. Maybe I'll let them introduce themselves first. Herbert.
Yeah, hi, I'm Herbert. I'm running a youth training organization in Sydney, based in Sydney, but I'm also a Chinese pastor in Chinese and Australian Baptist Church in Forney. So for, I think, 14 years. And he's Eric.
Yep, I'm Eric. I've been serving in the youth ministry as a youth leader for the past 10 years in Chinese Australian Baptist Church, Forney.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm currently at Evangelical Free Church of Australia at East Linfield. And I currently serve in cell group and also the English ministry team.
So, of course, the reason I asked you guys to come along, I think it is a good idea to have some second generation church leaders to really talk about their own experience, right? So maybe to start with, I'll ask you a few questions. First of all, in terms of leadership style, what do you see as the main differences between the first and second generation Chinese Christian leaders?
Eric, you want to start?
Yeah, I think for most first generation leaders, there's a huge age difference to the second generation leaders or even to the youth we're serving. So most of the time it's similar to how parents look at young kids or even teenagers. So they might initiate a lot of discussion or have a chance to allow you to give ideas, but most of the time they will be usually will go back to what they initiate in the beginning because they think that's the better idea. So, and I think this affects how the church leadership has been run. Yeah.
I see. Okay. And you, Jackie?
Yeah, I think I echo similar thoughts to what Eric was saying. I think generally the differences between more Chinese style leadership and maybe more Western style leadership is around the age. I would say the bulk of maybe Chinese congregations sit between, your 50s, 60s, sometimes 40s age range. But I think your Western style or your second generation is usually more around 20s to 30s. And I think a lot of it is influenced by, how we were all brought up. So, for example, Chinese style leadership would have been mainly either from Hong Kong or overseas. So there would be a lot more influences that way in your culture. Whereas, for example, your 20s and 30s, most people would be brought up here. And I think that's where the differences are in education, how we were taught to think. But I guess that would be kind of main differences.
Oh, I see. Well, Jackie, you have really helped me out because the next question I'm going to ask is really the reasons behind the differences. Of course, you have mentioned a few. Eric, you mind to add a bit?
I'll add into that. So in terms of education, in most of the Asian background leaders with the educations, it tends to be more kind of obeying to the leaders or more authoritative. So the leaders or maybe in schools, teachers give commands or orders, and you tends to get punished or you tends to get bad outcome if you don't follow. So it's in the genes to just follow the instructions. And so on the other hand, to lead also might equals to giving orders or giving instructions that those you lead should follow. Yeah.
Oh, I see. And you, anything to add?
I think it's interesting you say that. So I think as we all kind of would understand, typical Chinese Asian culture kind of follows the honor shame culture. So I think in terms of what that looks like, it's, in the family setting, in the group setting, you want to be, I guess, bringing honor to your family. You want to be doing well. You don't want to be saying things or doing things that kind of, shame them. And I think that's in the family kind of context. But I guess with all of us, how we were brought up kind of is influenced and influences how we lead in, I guess, ministry as well. And I think sometimes that can come into ministry settings, whether that be more, I guess, your first generation looking at what honor and shame kind of looks like. And that might be different to a second generation Asian, which still, I think, follows quite the honor shame, but what that looks like may be different to what the first generation thinks.
It is very interesting that you mentioned about honor and shame, because even the Bible, it talks about we should honor our elders and respect our parents, or honor our parents and respect our elders. Do you see there's any differences between first generation and second generation in terms of applying this principle, honoring your parents, or there's a gap?
Yeah, so I guess in the Bible it does talk about passages about children obeying their parents. And I think in a lot of Chinese cultures, that is what, honoring your parents look like, obeying. And I think that's what Eric was mentioning before. But I guess the question is, what defines a child? Is it up till the age where you're 18? Is it up to the age where you're financially independent? I think those kind of things that slightly more blurred in terms of, different generations and what they consider as children, and what it means, I guess, to obey and honor. Does it mean that if there's differences in opinion, does obeying mean you have to follow exactly what the other person says because that's obeying? Or is obeying the same as honor? I think there's sometimes there's a difference, but it might not look like there's a difference, and we might be confused sometimes.
I see. Sometimes I hear some senior pastors, particularly in the first generation, they use this imagery and say that we are a big family at church. So for example, in deacon's board and deacon's meeting, in even general meeting, we say we are a big family. Do you think it is possible that the domestic setting somehow, the principle applied in the domestic setting is also somehow transferred to a church setting, so that the senior leaders or the first generation leaders, they more or less see you guys and make you guys feel like you are their children or their...
I think that apply in the sense of family. I think it's the kind of relationship, and it's the kind of sharing happiness and ups and downs together. But also in a family, when everyone or most of the individuals in the family are individuals, they're independent, and they have their own thoughts, they have their own ideas, and they take responsibilities for themselves. That's even in a family, we still. I think in a family that everyone is mature, you can't expect someone to be just giving out orders or assuming that everyone else will just hear them and follow them, because there's something missing. Maybe there's a discussion missing, or there's some communication missing. So even in a family, communication is important for different members in the family to know, to contribute, and to know what kind of needs each other is facing. Because the most mature in the family might neglect some of the needs. So so I would agree. In terms of loving each other, church as a family is quite relevant, but not in terms of parenting.
I think Eric, you're right. I mean, communication is a big part in Christian culture. One way to show our love towards others is to really communicate well and also to listen well. I always, my daughters always tell me that when you listen, you should listen actively, because they feel like when they're talking to me, my mind is elsewhere. So do you feel like at church, you're not being listened to, or it's difficult to really communicate or express yourself freely because of this honor and shame culture, or this paradigm that you really have to respect your elders to such an extent that it's like respecting your parents? That means what? That means that when they speak, you listen. That's the end of it. More like when you speak, they may not listen. Like me, for example. Do you have that kind of experience or impression?
Well, first, even for my generation, in a family setting, it's still important to initiate discussion, a two-way discussion, to know, for family decision or even for individual needs. So in terms of church setting, sometimes I feel like it's hard to explain what exactly the second generation needs to. It's hard to explain to the first generations because it's hard for them to understand the context.
I
think,
see.
Yeah, so that's the hardest part.
Do you think that it relates to you actually choose to worship in a Cantonese congregation of a Chinese church? That makes the problem the issue more serious.
Yes, I think so because in a Chinese congregation of a Chinese church, most of the ministry have been running in a similar way, 99% similar for the last 10, 20, 30 years by maybe it's just some like the same group of leaders. So it's hard for them to know what the youth face might have changed already. So especially when some of the initiation that the youth initiates might be quite radical for them. So yeah, I think it's hard for them to understand that kind of context when they're from such different background.
I see. You have the same experience at your church?
Can you repeat the question again?
So will it be better in the English congregation, English side of the Chinese church?
Is it easy for you to express freely and to communicate what you want or what you think?
I guess a bit of context. Our church currently, we're actually on separate campuses.
Yes.
So on a week-to-week basis, we don't really see any other congregation apart from, apart from our own congregation, because we're all, not even in the same suburb. So I guess to talk about like expressing our views, it's kind of hard when you don't really see, people in the leadership team, who are running the church. I think that's one factor, which means that the relationship isn't necessarily there. And so if there is something, it's more difficult to bring up. I think from my point of view, though, I can see that church leadership, they do want to try and care. I think the intention is always good, to want to try and see what's going on with the younger people. But I think because of so many factors, like, for example, like location, culture, and just basically just not knowing who's in the congregation itself, it makes it very difficult for, leadership to really understand what the needs of a different generation would be, simply because there's not much communication.
Yeah, you mentioned the term relationship. I think that's very important because sometimes first generation leaders may have more relationship with their congregants, but then second generation leaders may have more relationship with their congregants, but then between these two congregations, they may not have much relationships because of course, in your church, you have different campuses. But even in your church, I understand that you go to the same sort of like location, but yet you may be even next room to each other, but you don't really know each other well or converse with each other. Is that the case?
Yes. The youth fellowship that I serve share the same venue on the same day.
Friday night.
And similar time slot. We share the same building. So the English fellowship used the one side hall and we use the main hall. We walk past each other. We use the kitchen together. But there's very rare communication that happens. So until some of the youth leaders initiate, why don't we form like a futsal team, like an indoor soccer team, so we can have more communication with the leaders in the English fellowship. Other than that, there's very few kind of build up to the relationship, even we're in the same church, but since we're in a different congregation.
Do you think that is because of differences in the mother tongue they use, or simply because of their age, or what? Or just because they don't have the time to meet up together? What do you think will be the main cause of that kind of, in a sense, lack of relationship?
I think there's a mix. So although we're in the similar age, and we serve kids with our youth in similar age, language is one of the barriers. So for some of the leaders from the Chinese congregation, even if they are youth leaders, they still found it difficult to communicate with the leaders from the English fellowships. And also, when both leaders in the Chinese congregation and English congregations are occupied by their ministries and tasks, so and there's very rare initiation from the church to spark up something. It's hard to initiate something. You literally have to step into, knock the door and then ask, oh, should we do something together?
You have to make an effort.
Yeah, you need effort and you need bravery to do that. Because after meeting each other for like 3 years, 5 years, walking past each other every Friday, and then one day you have to start.
So you may feel like that. It actually is like 2 or 3 churches under the same roof. It feels like that.
It's similar.
But I think the most pity thing is, apart from language, I think what Eric mentioned before, they speak the same Cantonese language, but the generation among themselves, they can't communicate very well, because I think Eric has been serving as a congregation member, so meet a lot of adults in the meeting. But every time he just sit there and then listen, because there's so many opinion from the elderly people.
I see.
Is it this experience that you have?
Yes, I think when I serve in the congregation, I think things get complicated. So there can be a lot of heated discussion about many things that we as youth leaders we rarely discuss. So it's something to learn, of course, but also I think it's the way that to tackle the problem is very different. That might be a cultural influences. So we tend to, for the youth or for the second generations, it's easy to avoid that kind of conflicts when they see heated discussion for something that they might think, oh, I can sort that out in 3 minutes. What's the point of spending 2 hours to host a meeting to sort that kind of stuff? So so for many youth leaders that involved in serving with first generation leaders or older leaders, it's hard for them to understand why it's such a lengthy process to sort that kind of stuff.
What do you think are some of the misconceived assumptions that the first generations have always made about you guys, about second generations? But you say, this is a time for me to clarify. This is totally misconceived. Please do not assume we are like that. Here's your chance. To announce it to the whole nation.
I guess a couple maybe that I think kind of alluded to this before, that we're a bit like lax. So I think the kind of general vibe is we're not serious. We're not serious about worship. And I think that shows in perhaps maybe, our attire when we go to service, like, wearing thongs might be acceptable. But, in a Chinese church, you would never wear thongs. You have to wear like your suit and tie,
in the Cantonese and Mandarin side.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like that kind of image, just because you're wearing thongs doesn't mean you don't take the word seriously. But I think there's a translation of, you're just like dressed really casually, therefore you must treat God's word casually. This is my perhaps assumption of what they are assuming of us. So again, there might be a two-way kind of misunderstanding here. And I think, a lot of times maybe also, I don't know if you would agree with this, but that we kind of, even though, we disrespect authority because we kind of just do whatever we want. But I think that may be true to an extent, but it also may be a reaction of not feeling like we're being heard. So we have to, I guess, take action to do something else. I'll just stick with 2 for now.
In terms of worship, because I'm also a worship leader and I serve in the worship ministry for a long time, I think I totally agree the point that we might not like for attire like thongs. I like wearing phones as well, although I serve in the Cantonese congregation. But when I get on the stage, I have to wear a suit, of course. But I think we sometimes we were misinterpret that we are not as serious. But then it might be just the way or we do things are different. Like we might not be as serious to the attire, but then we might be more serious to the audio quality. We spend hours to look at the gears and adjust the audio quality, or maybe even the song's arrangement, or the entire worship flow. So I think sometimes it's the cultural factors that and many assumptions to they were there. It makes it creates lots of misunderstanding. Like there's, for example, assuming that your attire reflects your seriousness to worship, that then something might miss. And also, I think for the younger generations, they tend to see themselves as individual more than the past generations. So does that mean they're not being respected? No, they're just trying to show that everyone can be different and everyone can have the different view to how things should work, and especially how things should work at church. And that doesn't mean they're not respecting the leaders. They just want to show that way might work too. So yeah.
Thank you for your input. So it may seem like we have painted a rather gray picture, but I don't think that is the case. So my next question is to help out to put some color in this painting, if I may say. So do you have anything positive to say that you have learned or that you really appreciate from the first generation leadership style?
Firstly, I respect their endurance. Like, imagine someone can serve in the same church, same ministry for the past 20 years.
Or like your parents nagging you for 30, 40 years.
I can't even see myself serving in the same role for like 10 years. Like, that's sounds ridiculous. But then I see lots of the first generation leaders. They are very serious to their commitment. When they take up a commitment, they can take it seriously, and they're willing to give up their time even some of the times that are not required by the church to make it work, or to improve how even for some very minor parts in the church, like how chairs were put, how the carpet color, or etc. But they are very serious to the ministry, which I respect.
Endurance and commitment.
Yeah.
And you, Jackie?
I think similar lines as well. I think, you can see the seriousness and the devotion of a lot of Chinese, leaders. The fact that you can be bothered to wear a suit to church every single week, I think to me that shows quite a lot of effort, that they really take service seriously, they take worship seriously. And I think even discussing church matters, usually like Chinese leaders are quite thorough in everything they do. Like they think about like every different kind of situation. And I think usually I feel like the ultimate goal of that is to make, the event or the service or whatever it is, the best experience for, church members as possible. So I think through all that and how they kind of deal with ministry, you can see, the devotion that they have.
Okay, thank you. With us in the audience, there are many first-generation leaders listening as well today. So my final question for you guys is, what do you think the second generation of leaders most want the first-generation leaders to know and to change to foster a better environment for personal growth and for kingdom expansion? What do you think the second-generation leaders most want the first-generation leader to know?
I think for most second-generation leaders, we want to see our roles and our involvement in the church plan in the next 5, 10, 20 years. We want to be part of that vision. We want to be serving together in the future, not just because usually how younger generation or how second generation leaders will look is the first generation leaders might say, "Oh, it's good to have lots of young people," end of story. But then we're not just there to show that there are young people in the church, because eventually
You'll get old.
Yeah, we won't be forever young. We want to be part of that church, part of sharing we want to be part of that vision to serve as well. But I think sometimes, especially in a Cantonese or a Chinese church setting, it's a very blurred picture in terms of like where the church is walking to, especially when there are so many changes happening in the whole in the entire environment. So, but still, we want to be part of that process of finding what's the next step for the church.
I think echoing that as well. I think, I think a lot of second generations would say that they want to feel, like they're being cared for and valued. And I think that's also in terms of their opinions and, I guess the way that they're doing ministry. Kind of what Eric was saying, want to be involved with that, involved in, I guess, decisions, involved in, just hearing us out, like, this is what we have to say. We know this is not everything, but this is just our point of view. And I think it's just being part of decision making. And I think just being heard.
Yeah, and maybe spend more time together, building up relationship, go and have a cup of coffee.
I think that would help a lot.
And have some more barbecues and hot pots and things like that.
Yeah.
That would be good. Yes.
Have you paid attention to the interview? Have you heard anything from the second generation? Any highlight? Any inspiration from Eric and Jackie? I think in conclusion, I would like to use the concept of paradigm shift to respond to the phenomenon. The paradigm shift refers to an important change that happens when the usual way of thinking about or doing something is replaced by a new and different way. Paradigm shift was firstly introduced by Thomas Kuhn, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, which had transformed the philosophy of science and changed the way many scientists think about their work. But this influence had extended well beyond this and has assimilated into popular culture, including the church culture. Paradigm shift occurs when a given context or set of assumptions have changed so dramatically over time that the resulting structures and the approach have to be radically rethought. The former way of thinking and doing no longer makes sense in the new climate, so new paradigms are required. One of the examples of this concept that we can find in the Bible is from Jesus' teaching on his parable of the new wineskin. The disciples, who can also be considered as the first Christian communities, follow Jesus wherever he goes during the 3 years of Jesus' ministry on earth. They witness the great work that Jesus carried out. Not only they follow what Jesus instructed them to do, but they were following Christ physically as well. However, we can see that after Jesus' death and resurrection, the disciples have to be changed. These disciples can see now where they could not see before. They have a clearer understanding and picture of God's kingdom. They are still followers of Christ, but instead of following Jesus around physically, they are now following Jesus' teaching to continue the work of God. The early Christians lived in a different world after the paradigm shift they have undergone. A paradigm shift does not happen easily. An intentional process of change must be well thought out to increase the chance of success for a necessary transformation. Moreover, since the institutional church has become the norm for Chinese churches for so long, the ministry practice of the leadership paradigm will undoubtedly sound and feel counterintuitive to most church leaders and members. The leadership work of the church is to listen to the common language of the community. However, this might be more than one common language that dominates in community, especially in complex communities like Chinese churches. Yet, even with these multiple language, common themes can be identified that give the complex community its identity and a sense of meaning. This common dominant language are never the only language in a community, as there is also the unspoken language, namely the stories that are not easy and freely shared. Have you heard what Eric and Jackie said? Assumption, listening, can't be heard. The calling of church leaders is ideally situated to listen to the stories, which are often only revealed in crisis counseling and pastoral care. These stories are told in a context of trust, because within a common language, this story would not make sense according to the norms and values of the common language, and thus would be suppressed or even condemned, just as what the second generation have shared before. So for the church, being open to God's involvement in the community brings about radical transformation in a sense of rebirth, death of the old self, and being born as a new creation, liberated by the deconstruction of the cross. Usually, transformation is interpreted as making a few changes, even fundamental changes, to the practice of the local church. For example, changing the way a church worship, or kind of activities in children ministry or youth ministry, or the way the church presents. In fact, these changes are not transformational, but can be interpreted as cosmetic changes. These cosmetic changes are still founded on what we believe to be correct practice based on a foundational truth, and thus it is still about having the truth that is packaged in the best possible way. Nothing has transformed with regard to foundation or the foundational truth. So what we are fear of? True transformation is definitely a gift of the process of listening to the trace of God's involvement in the community. As the Christ event brings about liberation from the dominant language and therefore creates space for impossible possibility. One of the illustrations I would like to help us to adjust ourselves to have new perspective is related to my recent studies on third culture kids. Both Eric and Jackie, they are third culture kids. The term third culture kids have been firstly used by two social scientists in the 1950s. Initially, they used the term third culture in order to refer to the learning process of how to relate one culture to another. They used the term third culture kids because they integrate the aspects of their home culture from which the adults came from as the first culture, and the new culture where the family lived as the second culture, subsequently create a unique institution, culture known as third culture. Third culture kids have been identified a set of behavioral patterns which have been formed by being raised in a cross-cultural environment as well as in a highly mobile world. This cross-cultural and high mobility aspect of their life upbringing have brought strong impact during their adolescence, as this is a time of significant growth and development in their physical, emotional, and cognitive dimensions. Eric and Jackie, they both have their adolescent growth in Chinese church, but one in Cantonese congregation and one in English congregation. We can see that they try to adapt, they try to take tasks, take risks, fall and pick themselves up again, while they feel at home everywhere and nowhere. As globalization has been emerging and the world has been changing, third culture kids have to deal with the complexity of the cultural difference. Being a third culture kid in church is uneasy as well, because they have to deal with the complexity of a church, Chinese church, especially the phenomenon that we brought up today, the communication between the first generation and the second generation. These cultural differences are no longer related to one location only, but may involve the entire cultural world changes, while value system, identity, and the relationship with family and friends have already been established and developed in their home culture. Culture is formed through learning instead of instinctive behavior, and is being caught from or taught by the surrounding environment and can be passed on through generations. Those behaviors, words, custom, and tradition are in fact just the outer layer that can be seen. However, the deeper inner layers of each culture involve belief, value, assumptions, and thinking process which no one can see. As they move from place to place, follow their parents, and the living environments have been changing rapidly. The different exposure to cultural values and the practice of community have made their life experience totally diverse from those young people who grew up in a stable and monocultural community. It is interesting to note that even among the third culture kids, such as between Eric and Jackie, they might be classified into different categories based on similarities or differences from their appearance, the way they speak English, and their worldview. One of the strengths of a third culture kid relate to their broad worldview, as they can observe and experience not only the geographical difference, but also on how people view life from different perspectives. Cross-cultural enrichment enhance them to learn valuable lessons from the deeper levels as they get used to living in a transitionary lifestyle. They become more and more adaptable to changes. With the trend of increasing multiculturalism and globalism, this shape a new and different world in a lot of perspective. Third culture, in fact, illuminate the insular and exclusive nature of the church, which motivate us to discover creative idea-informed methods and practice among different generations. We'll be able to accomplish what Christ envisioned his body, the church, is to about. Third culture is also a way we are to live rather than a strategy. Imagine in Chinese church, we have this group of third culture kids which are so adaptable to different culture. Why we still can't communicate? There must be some problem, there must be some issue that lie beyond our own human nature that cause the situation that even we share the same church building, but we don't have better communication. Or even in under one church, but different congregation go to different church venues, so they never communicate. It seems that communication is one of the way out. In conclusion, through our presentation, we would like to illustrate the present situation of having both first generation and second generation leaders serving together as a body in most Chinese churches. Throughout the interview, these two third culture kids, Eric and Jackie, we hope to bring out a channel to let all of us understand what they are actually thinking on and what they are actually feeling about their home on the earth. And hopefully, we will understand each other better. We have set up some questions for you guys to have some group discussion. Hope that the discussion will enrich each other.